I'm Ryan O'Dowd of the Black Hand Communique. Today's episode will be called Brick Breaker 2 Getting Serious on Syria. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about how the relationship between the BRICs nations and the West is developing specifically in the Syrian conflict and in the conflict with ISIS currently happening in the Middle East. All right. If you recall on the last episode, I talked about the BRICs and the West and how these two global economic cartels are at odds with one another. Specifically, that the West is doing everything it can to undermine Russia and Russian oil, and how the BRICS nation is doing what it can to undermine the American petrodollar and to weaken it. Um, I also explained in a previous episode called The Unholy Triumvirate about the United States security state, the government of Israel, and the government of Saudi Arabia, how there is a political pact between these three nations, unofficially, that results in a lot of the chaos and conflict in the Middle East. Now, that's exacerbated by this conflict of economics that we are undergoing currently with the BRICS nations. And for whatever reason, for all we know, it could be biblical prophecy. The main shock point of this conflict is Syria, and the battle of government led by Bashar Assad against a coalition of competing Islamist groups, so-called moderate rebels, and ISIS, which is universally considered to be a terrorist group. Pretty much every nation on earth agrees that ISIS is a terrorist group. In fact, it's got even Iran and Saudi Arabia cooperating with us against that particular group, ISIS. Now, the reason that Syria has become a flashpoint of conflict in the battle between the BRICS nations and the West is that Bashar al-Assad, since before the civil war in Syria began, has been an ally with Russia. Now, Russia is trying to export its oil to Europe. Europe is basically being forced by the United States to cut its imports of oil from Russia, which makes oil more expensive for Europe, while the United States basically is forcing Saudi Arabia to dump oil at a discount price to try to consume and expand their market in Europe and across the world while maintaining the petrodollar. I know it's all very technical, but bear with me and I will do my best to explain this. So, the United States, in order to hurt Russian oil exports, because the United States is trying to cripple Russia, because Russia is trying to break the hegemonic monopoly of the petrodollar that the United States currently holds worldwide. The United States is trying to get Bashar al-Assad to build a pipeline through Syria so that Saudi Arabian oil can be pumped directly into Europe, vis-a-vis Turkey and Syria, thereby decreasing the cost of oil to mainland Europe even further, thereby crippling Russia even more, thereby, my guess is, in the minds of the American strategists, pushing off and delaying the crash of the petrodollar. The people who are in the Department of Energy and in the head of the military and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and basically the strategic thinkers that operate the security state of the United States and do long-term planning know that when the petrodollar goes down, the United States is going to have massive inflation, and there will be a big social issue, and there might be a social cataclysm that happens as a result of that, or even, and I would not be historically hyperbolic to say it could lead to a revolution. actually, for many other reasons I won't go into right now, but another episode. So they're trying to stave that off because the security state of the United States and the banking establishment of the United States and the small oligarchy, the coalition of the ultra rich that run this nation, obviously don't want global competition from Russia and China in marketplaces, and they also don't want to empower the people of our country to have a bigger market share against them because their goal is ultimately complete control. It's monopoly. It's power for power's sake and money for money's sake and money for power's sake. So, the United States was like shrugging its shoulders and saying, we'll fund counter um, we'll fund insurgents in Syria to overthrow Assad because Assad won't build this pipeline. So we start funding the insurgents, and my guess is if we didn't already have the war in Iraq 10 years ago, that is a massive failure that has led to the rise of ISIS and the loss of American prestige globally, the death of tens of thousands of American soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians. If we hadn't already engaged in such a miserable experiment in Iraq and failed so horribly in our imperial ambitions over there, I doubt that the United States would be funding insurgents in Syria. The United States would probably just put boots on the ground in Syria and overthrow Bashar al-Assad ourselves like we did Iraq, like we did Saddam Hussein. The problem is, as from a strategic point of view of the military, the problem is Iraq was a miserable failure. Nothing we wanted to accomplish in Iraq got accomplished, to my knowledge. There were no weapons of mass destruction. We did not create a stable state. There is not a functioning democracy. There's sectarian violence all the time. We haven't gotten much even economically. Even if you wanted to argue for the sake of oil, most of the oil prices that came out of Iraq were absorbed into the machine of Halliburton or other companies and barely even reached the American people in terms of savings. It might have been like a 5 cent, 10 cent decrease, which didn't make up for the multi hundreds of billions of dollars a year war that was being fought. So, I mean, it was just a strategic blunder by any stretch of the imagination. And so that's why the United States doesn't have the political capital to just kill and overthrow Assad ourselves because it was wasted already in Iraq. So what they did what they could get away with, which is funding what they called moderate. There's no moderate politics in that region, but they called moderate rebels. And really, what they were just Islamist rebels that would be really willing to take money from the United States. The extremists are the ones that are Islamist rebels, and they're extreme because they won't take money from the United States. So, I mean, it doesn't amount to much anyway. Finally, Russia saw that the situation was, after years and years of this military funding by the United States, it was starting to deteriorate, and Assad looked pretty weak. So Putin just stepped in, started bombing the moderate rebels, what he called the terrorists, and restabilized Bashar al-Assad, who looks like he's going to last a while in there. And now, all of a sudden, because of that, the United States has now said they're going to put boots on the ground in the form of advisors. So now there's been a reversal of American policy, and ironically, it was Russia's entrance into the situation that gained the United States government the political capital to put men on the ground, and they're still intending to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. So what you have here is this little nation, insignificant in many, many ways, of almost no significance, even in its own region. It's not a powerhouse. Syria and Iran, pretty much in Israel, are the powerhouses over in the Middle East, and did I say Syria? I bet Saudi Arabia and Iran are pretty much powerhouses, but strategic because of its location and because of its historical significance as an ancient source of culture, and just really because of where it sits in geography. So now you have Russia funding sides in Syria, America funding sides in Syria, American soldiers in Syria, Russian soldiers in Syria, and you have what is essentially a second proxy war in the battle between the BRICs nation and the West over the petrodollar. And like I said, it's working out like a Cold War, just like the Cold War had Vietnam, Afghanistan, North Korea, crushing of the Hungarian, Czechoslovakian uprisings. Now you have Ukraine, and now we have Syria, and we will have another Iraq, I guarantee you. Even though ultimately it's pointless, the United States is staving off the inevitable in terms of the crash of the petrodollar, and Syria happens to be a flashpoint right now because of this pipeline that would put oil from Saudi Arabia directly into Europe. The same exact thing happened in Europe, except the pipeline, Russia was trying to force a pipeline to happen in the Ukraine, which backfired on them because America started the sanctions against them because of getting involved in the Ukraine. So you now have these two proxy wars, one in Eastern Europe and one in the Middle East, between the BRICS nations and the United States. And meanwhile, China, who doesn't have to spend anything to gain much of it, is gaining from both sides in the form of trade agreements. And they had a bit of a crash, but they're looking like they're doing pretty well now again. So basically, because of the petrodollar and because of the strategic resources of Russia being an oil exporter and the needs, the political needs of Israel and Saudi Arabia, and the promise of the United States to defend them with military, you have Syria now. And of course, if we didn't worry about the petrodollar, if we found a solution to the problem instead of just trying to delay the inevitable, then we wouldn't have to be in Syria at all. But the United States government is not interested in finding a solution to the problem of the petrodollar. It's interested in delaying the problem of the petrodollar. And that's another problem in and of itself. So, there you go. Syria is the flashpoint, and that's why. This has been called BRICS Nations 2, Getting Serious on Syria. I'm Ryan O'Dowd of the Black Hand Communique, saying, fuck the banks.